Hello, I'm Montse Alvarado, and this is EWTN News in Depth. A blockbuster Supreme Court decision siding with foster mothers and Catholic social services. Expert analysis of what the decision means for religious freedom. And communion and pro-abortion politicians, U.S. bishops debate. Important takeaways from their spring General Assembly and potential impact on American Catholics.
We were blessed tremendously when we started with the marriage encounter.
Plus, saying I do twice. How Catholic couples are strengthening their marriages.
In my professional opinion, there is no medical indication for gender affirmative therapy.
The transgender controversy, medical and ethical questions answered from a Catholic perspective. EWTN News in Depth is next. Hello and welcome to EWTN News in Depth. We begin with a groundbreaking, unanimous U.S. Supreme Court ruling protecting religious freedom for Catholic foster care agencies. Foster moms Sharon L. Fulton and Tony Sims Bush filed their case 2 years ago because the city of Philadelphia required the agency they work with, Catholic Social Services, to endorse same-sex relationships, which violates Catholic Church teaching. In a unanimous decision written by Chief Justice Roberts that took the country by surprise, all 9 justices decided that the city violated the group's free exercise of religion. Many see it as a win for religious freedom. Others say it didn't go far enough. Critics say it discriminates against same-sex couples. But the mothers say they have a right to practice their faith.
It has been a long journey for me and all of the families supporting Catholic Social Services during this legal battle. But I'm grateful that we can finally rest, knowing that the agency that has brought my family together can continue to do the same for other families.
Philadelphia has 29 other foster agencies that do certify LGBTQ couples. The city solicitor, Diana Cortez, issued a statement shortly after the ruling saying, quote, "The city will continue to protect and include all Philadelphians, including LGBTQ youth and families, while recognizing and respecting the Supreme Court's ruling." To provide analysis on just what this decision means and why it's so important, we turn to Lori Wyndham, senior counsel with the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty and the attorney that argued the case before the Supreme Court last fall. Lori, it's great to have you with us today. So our viewers know we're colleagues at the Becket Fund, where we worked on this case together. Tell us more about this decision. What did the Supreme Court actually do? And does it matter that the decision was unanimous?
It absolutely matters that the decision was unanimous. The Supreme Court in this case said that Philadelphia was wrong to try and exclude Catholic social services because of its religious beliefs and practices regarding marriage. And this is a really powerful statement coming from all 9 justices. You know, we've seen the court in recent years go in other directions with same-sex marriage, with hiring and firing protections. But what they did this time was they all came together and realized that there was a common sense solution here, that it was not necessary to exclude Catholic social services from foster care in Philadelphia, and that in fact it was counterproductive because it meant fewer homes available for children and less support for foster moms like Sharon L. Fulton and Tony Sims Bush.
And so that's the question that they were answering. Did the city of Philadelphia violate the religious freedom of these foster moms and the religious foster care agency when they gave them this false choice of certifying same-sex couples or getting out of the foster care business altogether?
That's exactly right. What the Supreme Court said was that it violated our Constitution. It violated the Free Exercise Clause for the city of Philadelphia to try and exclude foster parents and exclude Catholic social services because of its religious beliefs and practices on marriage. There was no need to put them to that choice.
So then, Lori, let's take a step back. Why is this a religious freedom issue? Why does Catholic Social Services, the social services arm of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, why do they have to do foster care work?
This is something that the church has been doing for millennia, and this is something that they've been doing in Philadelphia for 200 years. This is something that is a natural outgrowth and extension of their faith. It's how they exercise their religion, caring for the widow and the orphan, reaching out to serve those in need, and finding homes for children who have lost their parents or whose parents are unable to care for them. That's a great ministry they've been carrying on all this time, and now they're free to continue carrying it on.
Lori, some are saying this is a narrow opinion and that it only applies to Catholic social services in Philadelphia. Can you clarify?
This is a broad opinion. This is a controversial issue that many people were thinking the court was going to splinter on, and instead they came together and said the city of Philadelphia couldn't exclude Catholic social services. That's great news for social service providers across the nation because it shows that the government has to treat them fairly, it has to respect their religious exercise, and that when they're out there on the front lines doing good, when they're finding homes for kids, the government doesn't have a good reason to come in and kick them out. And that's what the Supreme Court said yesterday.
So one more thing that many people are scared of, is there a way for the city to get around this ruling?
I think that would be awfully difficult. If the city wants to go back and try and change the rules again, then I think they'll just violate the free exercise clause again, because what they would be doing is changing the rules in order to exclude a religious group that they don't like. And that violates the free exercise clause too. The Supreme Court has already told us that Philadelphia's system and Philadelphia's children do better when Catholic social services, when Sharon L. Fulton, when Tony Sims Bush are able to serve. And I think that's what the courts are going to expect to see from Philadelphia going forward.
And so then the question on everyone's minds, what comes next? What does this mean for agencies that closed before this case, like in Boston or the state of New York, or even here in Washington, D.C.? Can we expect agencies to reopen around the country?
I hope that's exactly what they can do. This decision really does open a pathway and open a door for these agencies to be able to say, hey, we've done great work before, we can do it again. And the Supreme Court and our laws and our Constitution provide us a way to do that. So I'm hopeful that this will mean more open doors for agencies and more homes for children.
Lori, we're hopeful too. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Monse.
In another major ruling, the Supreme Court also voted to keep the Affordable Care Act in place. The move upholds health care coverage for millions of Americans. Several Republican-led states argued the individual mandate, which requires Americans to obtain health insurance or pay an income tax penalty, is unconstitutional. In a 7-2 vote, the court said challengers did not have legal standing to sue because they did not prove the law actually harmed them. Turning now to another major story, the Spring General Assembly of the United States Catholic Bishops. The controversial subject on whether to draft a document about the Eucharist in the life of the Church and the need for Catholics to be worthy to receive the sacrament divided the bishops. Reporter Mark Irons explains.
Receiving the most attention at this year's U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops summer meeting,
the beauty and meaning of the Eucharist in the life of the Church is what unites us.
The proposed drafting of a formal statement on the Eucharist. Bishop Kevin Rhodes, chairman of the Committee on Doctrine, said a document is critical, as many Catholics don't understand Christ is fully present in the bread and wine.
We have seen the national surveys indicating that many Catholics understand the Eucharist to be only a symbol.
Discussion followed in approval and concern with drafting any document and the possible broader implications.
I'm not yet on board with this.
Some concerns centered on the final document being used as a means to deny communion to public figures who oppose church teaching, including Catholic President Joe Biden for his support of abortion.
There is an expectation out there by people, because of what some bishops are arguing for, that we deny communion to the president, to Speaker Pelosi.
But other bishops said the document would be focused on church teaching, important for all to hear.
An opportunity for very clear, succinct teaching on the dignity, the beauty, for example, of Holy Communion, and will really help us with the revival and really helping people understand. So I see it as we have a responsibility.
Also during the meeting, the National Review Board, focused on preventing sexual abuse in the church, reported on allegations tracked in a 2020 audit.
The number of current allegations reported this year is 22, which is less than the previous year. Of course, one is too many.
The bishops voted on action items, including the authorization of the development of a new formal statement for Native American and Alaska Native ministry.
There is not a guide for the Catholic Church in the United States in approaching, understanding, and promoting Catholic native ministry.
And proposed drafts of pastoral frameworks for marriage and family life, as well as young adult ministry.
To help dioceses with insights and suggestions for building up the work in their local church.
Mark Irons, EWTN News in depth.
Turning now to someone who has attended multiple USCCB meetings and can provide more clarity on this subject. We bring in EWTN News Executive Editor and Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief Dr. Matthew Bunson. Thank you for joining us, Matthew. The debate over a document on the Eucharist and the life of the Church dominated this meeting. What was the resolution? What was that about?
Well, the resolution, after several days of contentious discussion and debate, including 3 hours of discussion yesterday, was a vote. The vote was taken yesterday. We saw the results today. It's a statement vote from a large majority of the bishops, only 55 opposed, approving the draft that's to come. About 168 bishops supported it, and they had six abstentions in terms of the vote. That's a whopping majority in favor of proceeding, despite everything that we've been hearing over the last few days. There's an interesting side note to that, too, is the fact that there were original 67 signatories of the letter that circulated just before the meeting, asking that no discussion be had at this meeting at all on this document. So this is quite a turnaround.
So then some of the opposition did drop off. The bishops also discussed a plan for Eucharistic revival. What is that?
Well, this is presented by Bishop Andrew Cousins, who is the chair of the Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis, and basically it is what it sounds like. An effort on the part of the bishops is an element in their strategic plan to spark a genuine Eucharistic revival in the country, to help Catholics to understand and treasure more deeply the real presence of the Eucharist and the Eucharist in the life of the Church. So this is, I think, going to be an important initiative by the conference.
And was this met with any controversy?
There's always some discussion about it, but I think every bishop realizes and recognizes that given the recent poll numbers, or perhaps as few as 50% of Catholics believe in the real presence, the challenges we've had with COVID, that no, this is the time for a new initiative, for a revival of the Eucharist.
So then going back to the vote on Eucharistic cohesion, what's next? What can we expect?
Well, with the green light firmly lit, the Doctrine Committee under Bishop Kevin Rhodes will be proceeding with its work over the summer. They'll be in consultation with multiple committees at the USCCB and other experts, and I think we can anticipate a draft of the document presented to the bishops, I'm assuming, live and in person come November at their main meeting that'll be coming up.
And so that's another General Assembly that we can expect.
That's right.
Wonderful. Well, we'll have you back to talk about it. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Good to be with you.
Still to come on EWTN News in Depth, the first new federal holiday in nearly 40 years is signed into law. And next, a special prayer request from Pope Francis for the month of June.
The Church welcomes people to come forward and have their marriage convalidated.
The fulfillment couples say they're experiencing after bringing Catholic civil unions into the Church.
We saw that couples were getting kind of a one-day shot in the arm for their relationship, and that's it. But priests and permanent deacons, they receive years of formation, and so why aren't couples receiving marriage formation? Marriage is not a second-class sacrament.
And a panel discussion with experts leading marriage formation and convalidation programs. Welcome back to EWTN News in Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. Pope Francis released a prayer for the sacrament of marriage at the beginning of this month, asking the Church to pray for couples about to embark on the lifelong journey. In a video message, the Holy Father recognized that marriage is demanding and complicated at times, but says that sharing one's life through marriage is beautiful and that it's worth the effort. He reminded the faithful that a husband and wife are not alone in their union, that Jesus accompanies them, and it's a life that a couple is called to.
El matrimonio no es solo un acto social, es una vocación que nace del corazón.
Pope Francis says that with our prayers, young couples can grow in love and generosity. The prayer request comes after marriage rates in both the U.S. and Europe have fallen. While some couples are preparing to take vows, other couples are preparing to take their second vows. Catholics who were married in civil ceremonies are bringing their marriage into the church through a process called convalidation. Kate Scanlon gives us a look at a program underway in New York City, guiding couples through the sacrament of matrimony.
It's not you or me, it's us, and it's God, and we love God together, and we say yes to God.
The Archdiocese of New York recently launched a convalidation awareness campaign calling civilly married Catholic couples to be married in the church.
Catholic marriage recalls the love of Jesus Christ for his people. It succeeds with the help of the Lord. We call that grace.
In a welcome video for couples participating in the program, Cardinal Timothy Dolan thanks participants for discerning marriage as a sacrament. Kathy Wither of the Archdiocese of New York explains the goal of the program.
I think the biggest thing is to bring more Catholic couples back to the church, to experience that, the joy that you truly do get and that peace.
Fernando and Cydia Cortez, who are participating in the awareness campaign, each had only received the sacrament of baptism when they were married at Yonkers City Hall in 1986. They had a Catholic ceremony in 2010.
When we met and we decided to get married, we didn't really understand that the best marriage we could have was to be married in the church, to have that sacrament.
But the couple said they eventually felt something missing, so they began the convalidation process.
It was so beautiful, all this journey that we've been together.
New York couple Jeff and Claudia Cortez, no relation, had an outdoor wedding before they marked their 10th anniversary with a church wedding in 2000.
We were blessed tremendously when we started with the marriage encounter, and then our lives just evolved and changed drastically, and we just have been blessed with tremendous joy and fulfillment and purpose.
God has really allowed us to trust him and to know that we're not alone.
Convalidation is a process by which a civil marriage becomes a sacramental marriage in the Catholic Church. Dr. John Grabowski, a professor of moral theology and ethics at the Catholic University of America, explains that it can be as simple as confirming eligibility to marry in the church and exchanging vows in a Catholic ceremony.
So there's a process that the church calls convalidation, and it can sound a little bit involved, but it's really a pretty simple process.
The nature of valid Catholic marriages was a recent topic of discussion when British Prime Minister Boris Johnson married Carrie Simons in a Catholic ceremony at Westminster Cathedral, despite Johnson's 2 previous divorces.
Someone who has been married twice, divorced, but received decrees of nullity, annulments for those unions, is free then to enter into a sacramental marriage in the church.
Grabowski suggests that civilly married couples reach out to a priest who can guide them through the convalidation process.
And it's worth it because the outcome is you have a sacramental marriage so that the couple going through the ups and downs of life together, which every couple does, has the grace of God supporting them.
Kate Scanlon, EWTN News, In-Depth.
Marriage formation for couples seeking convalidation is a process that's unique to each couple. We now speak with 2 women who lead enrichment and preparation programs for this sacrament. Deanna Johnson, the Executive Director of Family Life for the St. Philip Institute of Catechesis and Evangelization in Tyler, Texas, and Mary Rose Verrett, a co-founder of Witness to Love in Lafayette, Louisiana. Thank you both for joining me. Deanna, I'd like to get started with you. First, can you tell us about the church's efforts on a diocesan level to bring civil unions into the church?
So at a diocesan level, what we've recognized is that there really is a need for intentional invitation to couples who are in irregular marriage situations. In the Diocese of Tyler, we've actually noticed that about 50%, if not more, of our marriages are actually convalidations. And that's because we have a high Latino community here, which is wonderful. But oftentimes what happens is that no one's invited these couples into a time of formation. So the church being more intentional about seeing these moments of encounter, and if the sacrament of matrimony is as important as we say it is, that we should be more intentional and direct with these multiple multiple touch points that we have with couples to invite them in, whether that's baptism or sacrament formation for their own children, or just in their involvement in the parish.
And what are those situations that they're in that would bring them into the situation? Is it people that are civilly married and don't know about the sacrament, or who don't feel like they could qualify to have that sacrament? I don't even know if that's the right word.
Yeah, so it's kind of a mixture of things, and it depends on the person. And that's another thing that it's been really important for the church to recognize, is that every couple is different. So you have couples who have been civilly married, part of it for maybe immigration reasons, or just simply because that was an easy first step. Some couples didn't realize that they needed to get married in the church. For others, it might be divorce and remarriage, and just not knowing what the church teaches or what the proper process was. For others, there may be a hesitancy to get married in the church, or it was easier to get married on a beach or to go to the chapel just to avoid some of the programs or processes. But when the church affirms the goodness of what marriage is joyfully, and we're intentional about that formation and invitation, that really does make a difference in people's receptivity to the sacrament.
Yes, absolutely. Mary Rose, you know all about that invitation. Why did you get involved in this ministry, working with engaged couples and married couples on marriage formation? Can you expand on what that means?
Oh, absolutely. And so marriage formation, and I love that you chose the word marriage formation and not just marriage preparation, because preparation insinuates that there's an end, but formation means it's ongoing. And so, I know that even in Deanna's diocese, that's really the terminology, and we're seeing an increase in that. So marriage formation is so much more enjoyable than marriage preparation because you're working with couples who want more, and they really desire more. Witness to Love was founded almost 10 years ago, and it really was a ministry born of, I would say, desperation in the Holy Spirit, because we were seeing couples that we had prepared for marriage at the diocesan level, at the big group conferences. We were seeing them get divorced. We were seeing friends and family members get divorced who are around the same age as us. And so for us, it was a really, really important just need that we saw. We saw that couples were not being accompanied. We saw that couples were getting kind of a one-day shot in the arm for their relationship, and that's it. But priests and permanent deacons, they receive years of formation. And so why aren't couples receiving marriage formation? Marriage is not a second-class sacrament, and couples need this formation. And so it's something that we were very passionate about in the beginning, and over time we've only gotten more and more passionate about. And so there's no shortage of need, but there is a shortage of people to recognize that need, especially in leadership and in decision-making positions. And we're so grateful to work with people like Deanna who see the need and every day are focused on that need and meeting that need.
Deanna, as a director of family life for the St. Philip Institute, can you tell us specifically how that works? Once the paperwork is filled out, do you end up having a wedding ceremony, or is it like a renewal of vows that can happen at the end of Mass? What does it actually look like?
Yeah, so for a couple who's seeking convalidation, really it starts with the relationship with the priest, and it's really up to the couple to discern how they want to celebrate that. And I like the flexibility that we have with the couples that we're working with, that it's not just like throwing them through a hoop, but really walking with them. So for some couples, it might even be a group celebration within the parish with other couples who are celebrating convalidation. For others, it may be a private ceremony just between them and the priest and their witnesses. But really inviting them into the community, and which is one of the reasons why we've chosen Witness to Love as one of the tools to help us accompany couples, is because it's very intentional about bringing them into the life of the parish, that we're not just trying to check a box for the sacrament. We're really trying to invite them into deeper communion with the church and with Jesus Christ.
And why is that so important? Why is it important not to check the box? Is there something about the sacrament of matrimony or even the convalidation of a civil union that strengthens the church and community?
Oh, absolutely. And I was thinking about a paragraph from the Catechism 2225, I believe it is, where it talks about how parents are the primary formators of their children, but it's specifically through the sacrament of matrimony that they receive the grace that they need to evangelize their children. And thinking about that, if we invest in this intentional formation with couples who may not have received the sacrament or understand the grace, that the grace of the sacrament is a real thing and that it has an impact on our communities, because when we have strong marriages, we have strong families, which helps the life of the parish, and the witness of other couples to one another has a significant impact on the life of the parish.
Mary Rose, the Witness to Love website specifically mentions using modern principles of psychology in facilitating dialogue for a couple's relationship. You were talking about these tools, right? First, tell me about the psychology and then how that integrates with biblical teaching and the Catechism, as Deanna just quoted. What does that then look like?
Absolutely. So the modern principles of psychology, what we're referring to specifically there is attachment theory. And so in attachment theory, it looks at the attachment styles of basically infants and their parents, whether they're avoidant or whether they're really secure in that attachment. And so if somebody has grown up in a home where their parents were divorced, they are more likely to be really, I would say, more avoidant in the way that they attach to others, in their relationships, in their friendships, and even in their future marriage. And so when we have such a high number of young people who are getting married, who are coming from divorced homes where they have this lack of trust of relationships, of even the person they're marrying, of the church, of just being in relationship, healthy relationship, they need that modeled for them. And so in Witness to Love, we have engaged couples choose a married couple whose marriage they admire, a couple they're attracted to. There's three things we talk about: attraction, relationships, and trust. And so in order for really marriage formation and accompaniment to be fruitful, there always has to be these three things: attraction, relationship, and trust. And if you pull any one of those out, the entire accompaniment process just falls flat, because you can't accompany someone who doesn't trust you. You can't accompany someone you're not in a relationship with. It just all falls short. And so when we say using modern principles of psychology, that's what we're referring to, that all of these things that we talk about with basically infants and parents also apply to engaged couples and mentors. And so the mentor couple is that sort of safe haven for them to be able to have difficult conversations, grow in their relationships, and grow in virtue. And so when you're referring to virtue, the sort of virtuous relationships, that's what allows us to really live out a healthy sacramental marriage, right? Is to be, all of the things that, charity and kindness and patience, all of these things that are so important. And what we learned is that you can't acquire virtue from behind a podium or in a classroom. Virtue is caught, not taught. And so especially when we were talking about couples who are civilly married, who have maybe been married 10, 15, 20 years civilly, and they don't have the grace of the sacrament. They don't have the marriage formation. They don't have the, someone there to really model for them what it looks like to live out a sacramental marriage. They might have a great relationship at a natural level, but even the best relationship at a natural level is not a sacramental marriage. And so, we always think marriage is tough and difficult, and it's beautiful, but you do need the grace of the sacrament, and you need someone to walk with you. And so we rely heavily on, the catechism, scripture, church teaching, theology of the body, all of these things to construct a pathway that really is a platform for evangelization and discipleship, no matter whether it's an engaged couple or a civilly married couple. We all need to be discipled and accompanied.
Deanna, one last wrap-up question for you. You talked to us about the Latino community, but what about young people? What are you seeing in engaging young people who seem hesitant to get married in the church?
Yeah, one of the things that we've really looked at in utilizing Witness to Love, just to echo what Mary Rose said, is that the evangelization that we do has to be attractive, and there has to be a relationship element. Otherwise, they aren't going to trust us. A lot of the couples that come to our retreats, they may not trust the church, but affirming that the church wants them to have a successful marriage. That's a huge part of our marriage formation ministry, that God loves them, that the church wants what's best for them and wants them to succeed, because we see the value of marriage and affirming their desire for beauty and goodness and truth, and making that commitment to walk alongside them. So we have to be intentional about walking alongside instead of just preaching from the pulpit, or and while all of those things are important, but to take someone by the hand and to walk with them through the formation process, whether it's an engaged couple, a young engaged couple, or a civilly married couple.
Well, thank you both for this important discussion, and hopefully we're setting up these marriages for success.
Thank you.
You can check out more of this conversation on our social media channels, where I speak with Mary Rose and Deanna about resources for convalidation and marriage. Follow EWTN News in Depth on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to watch our social media extra coverage. You can also share our segments and stories with your friends.
Brother Kelly, by the authority vested in me, I am proud to install you as Supreme Knight of the Order of the Knights of Columbus.
Still to come, taking the seat as head of a more than 130-year-old Catholic organization. The words Supreme Knight Patrick Kelly shared during his installation ceremony. Plus, an appeal for help in the restoration of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. High-level international diplomacy tops the week in review. Perhaps the most anticipated event, the summit between U.S. President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin. The two leaders met in Geneva, Switzerland for face-to-face discussions at a time when both countries acknowledge relations are near an all-time low. The long agenda included discussions about malicious cyber attacks by Russian-based hackers, the jailing of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, and interference in American elections. After their 4-hour meeting, both leaders expressed cautious optimism. They share a better understanding of each other's positions.
There's no substitute, as those of you who've covered me for a while know, for face-to-face dialogue between leaders. None. And President Putin and I had share a unique responsibility to manage the relationship between two powerful and proud countries. A relationship that has to be stable and predictable.
Biden told Putin there are 16 specific areas critical to America's infrastructure that should be off limits to cyber attack. If violated, Biden says he warned Putin America has significant cyber capabilities too and will respond. Both sides also agreed to return their ambassadors to their posts in Moscow and Washington. The U.S.-Russia summit came a day after a meeting of NATO leaders in Brussels. For the first time, the 30-member alliance addressed China's growing global power with a specific mention of the communist regime's expanding nuclear arsenal. In a joint statement, NATO said China's assertive military behavior, human rights violations, and use of disinformation threaten global order. President Biden has been adamant about reestablishing a strong relationship with the world's other democracies. He assured the NATO nations that the U.S. will stand by its NATO allies and defend democracy. The United States now has a new federal holiday honoring the end of slavery, Juneteenth, or June 19th. President Biden signed into law late this week, June 19th, which commemorates when Union soldiers brought the news of freedom to enslaved Black people in Galveston, Texas, 2 months after the Confederacy had surrendered. This is the first new federal holiday in nearly 40 years. The Texas Supreme Court has tossed out a libel case against the Catholic Diocese of Lubbock, filed by a former deacon. Jesus Guerrero claimed defamation after the diocese published a list of credibly accused sex abusers of minors in an effort for transparency. Guerrero faced accusations of abusing an adult woman with a history of mental and emotional disorders in 2003 and again in 2008. The diocese clarified the list, noting it included vulnerable adults as well as children. Texas justices ruled the diocese has a First Amendment right to decide its own governance. Guerrero's attorney says he hopes the U.S. Supreme Court will reverse the ruling. Vermont is now the first state in the nation to lift all COVID-19 restrictions after achieving the highest partial vaccination rate in the U.S. At least 80% of its population, aged 12 or older, has received at least one dose of the vaccine in Vermont. The state also has the highest fully vaccinated population, with nearly 62% receiving both doses. Restrictions on capacity limits and mask mandates are now all lifted. In response to the improving COVID situation, the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, the most populated in the United States with more than 4 million Catholics, will fully reopen this weekend. Archbishop Jose Gomez announced he is lifting the dispensation to attend Mass on June 19th. All liturgical celebrations, including Mass, First Communions, weddings, confirmations, and more, will now be allowed to take place indoors without capacity limits, social distancing, or any reservation systems. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris is launching a multi-million-dollar appeal to restore the interior of the cathedral following the devastating fire in 2019. The French government is overseeing the cathedral's structural restoration, but the Archdiocese of Paris is responsible for the interior renewal. Under the initiative, 2 projects a year will be presented to donors. The first 2 are the restoration of the reliquary case of the Crown of Thorns, damaged in the rescue of the relic, and the creation of a new tabernacle. The cathedral is set to open in 2024. This is the year dedicated to the foster father of Jesus, Saint Joseph. This weekend, we take time to celebrate our fathers for Father's Day. And before we head to the break, we wanted to take a moment to share photos of some fathers of our EWTN News In-Depth staff. Happy Father's Day.
We should actually be looking at the root cause of why these individuals do not identify with their bodies and with the way they were created.
Diving into a sensitive subject, gender dysphoria. A panel discussion up next. Welcome back to EWTN News in Depth. The U.S. Department of Education is reversing Trump-era guidance on Title IX protections. Title IX is a federal civil rights law passed as part of education amendments in 1972. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex for those in education programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. While the law includes protections for people based on sexual orientation, the Department of Education is now expanding its interpretation to also include gender identity or protections for transgender individuals. There's a lot to unpack on the subject of transgender ideology and medical treatments for it. Dr. Monique Robles joins us now to offer her professional opinion. Thank you for speaking with us today. Dr. Robles, gender confusion or gender dysphoria is defined by the American Medical Association as a psychological condition. First, can you explain exactly what that means?
Of course. So gender dysphoria, as related to the distress associated with any individual who do not identify with their biological identity or their biological sex. So it happens to do with the distress, which is supposedly socially induced. And so the idea with society is to reduce that stigma. However, what's happening now is that the WPATH and the American Psychiatric Association and others are attempting to depathologize this distress or this association with gender dysphoria and basically normalize any individual who does not identify with their biological sex.
And then what are the best treatments for this? You say that there's a diagnosis that is trying to kind of being erased, but in the meantime, this is still a dysphoria and it's still something that's being treated.
Okay. So the recommended treatment right now is gender affirmative therapy, which has to do with social transition, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then sex reassignment surgery for those, or gender, what they now call gender confirmation surgery for those who desire This is the widespread recommended treatment. However, the psychological component is being minimized, which is actually what needs to be emphasized. And so in my professional opinion, there is no medical indication for gender affirmative therapy. We should actually be looking at the root cause of why these individuals do not identify with their bodies and with the way they were created. And in doing so, we will be able to unpack a lot of mental health comorbidities that exist in these individuals.
What do you mean by mental health comorbidities?
Sure. So many of these individuals suffer from anxiety, depression. Often there's an association with autism and spectrum disorders, oppositional defiant disorders. So if these are not addressed and are present prior to the gender identity discrepancy that arises, then we are missing important details in an individual's history.
So you were mentioning the World Health Organization for Transgender Care. They've stated that most children grow out of this gender dysphoria. Does this guide the treatment in some way?
So the WPATH says that most children grow out. However, the recommended treatment does not allude to this because what's actually happening is that children who are started on this pathway tend to continue on this pathway, which is the opposite of the natural course or the natural progression of those who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Typically 80 to 85% of these children by adolescence will identify with their sex and without any intervention.
You were mentioning that this new standard of care, the affirming care, is something that's recent. How recent is it?
Sure. So in 2007, the first gender identity clinic was opened at Boston Children's, and it began after looking at the Dutch protocol in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And actually, the early Dutch protocol did not call for social affirmation. This is a more recent addition to gender affirmative therapy. It used to be the beginning with the puberty blockers and then moving on to the cross-sex hormones. However, now affirmation is the initial stage, and it's actually beginning outside of medicine and in classrooms.
So let's talk a little bit about adults and not just children. It's been reported that at times this treatment is recommended because they're trying to reduce suicide risk. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure, that is the purported benefit of this therapy. However, there have not been studies to show that there is a reduction in suicides. In actuality, in the LGBT community, the suicide rate based on transgender LGBT surveys is about 40% in this population, which is 10 times higher than the general population in the United States. There was actually a study that is often quoted that was performed in Sweden looking at 30 years of individuals who underwent sex reassignment surgery, and those individuals were still at 20 times the risk of suicide after.
So it's not necessarily affecting that desire for suicide. It's not actually a counter to that. There's one last question that I have for you, just about a recent 60 Minutes report that talked about people who regretted their transgender transition surgeries. Is this detransitioning regret something that you see often as a doctor?
Well, in my field, I work in pediatric critical care, and so I don't tend to see these individuals. However, in the clinic and outpatient settings, it's possible. The concern I have is that these individuals are not receiving the platform they need to speak because it undermines the gender affirmative therapy that is recommended. So there is an individual, Walt Heyer, who's well known. He transitioned to be a female in his adult life for 8 years and then detransitioned. He now has a website that I highly recommend if individuals would like to go and understand the stories. It's called Sex Change Regret. And on this website, he has a page dedicated to the voices of those who are detransitioning and have been misled by the medical profession.
Well, we're grateful for your expertise and for coming on this show and explaining this to us, Dr. Robles.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We turn now to the ethical implications the redefining of gender can have on society. To offer her expert opinion on the matter, we invited Mary Rice Hassan, a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Institute, to join us. Mary directs a program that focuses on gender ideology called the Person and Identity Project. Mary, thank you so much for being with us. To kick us off, give us some framework. You've talked and we've heard a lot about gender ideology. What is gender ideology?
Gender ideology is a set of beliefs about the person and about what a human being is. And one of the important things to know that both Pope Francis and the Vatican document from the Congregation on Catholic Education have emphasized is that what is proposed by gender ideology, the understanding of the person, is in direct conflict with Christian anthropology, because instead of seeing the person as created by God, lovingly created as male or female, the person is presumed under gender ideology to be able to define themselves. So your identity becomes the choice of the individual, is the way the Vatican document phrased it. And that's not, it's neither reality, because you can't change sex, but it's also just not true in a deeper sense. We're created beings, and we need to acknowledge that. There's a design to our bodies. We have a human nature, and gender ideology sweeps all of that aside and says that it all comes down to our feelings, our self-perception, or gender identity, as they call it, regardless of our body, and that we're free to self-create, to define ourselves.
So you mentioned church teaching on this, and most medical associations as well define sex as binary. And from a Catholic perspective, our Bible teaches us God made us both male and female, as you mentioned. There's this push now to redefine sex, and some who say that sex is assigned by doctors at birth. How does that conflict then directly with church teaching?
Well, first, it conflicts with basic biology because sex refers to the organism's organization towards a reproductive role. And reproduction occurs when sperm meets egg. Those are the only two components. There are only two sexes across biology. And so for the human being, you are created male or female, and that doesn't change. It's reflected on the cellular level. It's reflected in your entire body's organization, a whole body, whole person. It's not just sort of parts, which is sometimes the way it's spoken of in the media or among people who are promoting the idea of transgender identities, as if you swap out certain body parts and that changes who you are. So that's just not true. And the church also points out that we're created as a unity of body and soul. It's impossible to conceive of being me without understanding that who I am is an embodied person. We don't separate the two. But gender ideology proposes something different. It says a person's self-perception, their gender identity as it's called, can override the reality of biological sex. And further, it goes on to say that society should be affirming and validating of those identities, those self-perceptions, and grant access and rights on the basis of that self-perception. Again, regardless of the truth about the person, the reality that you can't change sex, and the reality that men and women are different, and women in particular, sex discrimination laws came about to give women opportunity while at the same time recognizing the importance of sexual difference and protecting our privacy, protecting our safety, and that's been permitted under the law. But now with these changes to insert gender identity in the law and to redefine sex to include gender identity, it really just steamrolls right over females' rights, but also just obliterates our common understanding of the human person as a unity of body and soul. Sex doesn't change. Our feelings, our self-perception cannot override that. So we're all kind of being forced in some ways to live in a world that is spinning this narrative that is simply not true. It's not grounded in reality.
And Mary, you're also a lawyer and you've testified before Congress on this issue. Let's lean into the legal implications that you were mentioning. Last year, the Supreme Court redefined sex in Title VII for employment protections. How does that redefinition of sex impact society more broadly?
Well, the Supreme Court was very careful in the Bostock decision is what you're referring to as a Title VII employment case. And it specifically said sex discrimination on the basis of sex includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. But it presumed in that opinion that sex was referred to biological sex, the difference between male and female. But in the ensuing year, what we've seen with the change of administration is a full court press to expand, to extrapolate from the Bostock decision and to say that even though that decision recognized that there are religious liberty implications, there are privacy implications, there are all sorts of other areas of the law that are touched by this idea of sex and sexual difference and discrimination law. And the administration instead has sort of swept that aside and proclaiming that they're simply applying Bostock. They have said, no, sex means gender identity. And that's how we're going to interpret it across the federal government, Title IX, things like that. And really, people need to understand that when you say gender identity, that definition means self-perception, your feelings, regardless of sex. So it specifically overrides the idea that the law previously recognized sexual difference and the need to ensure equality while protecting privacy and safety. And so under the Equality Act, under many of the changes proposed by this administration, all of that is put at risk, and including the whole issue of religious liberty. But even just looking at the implications of redefining sex in a way that is just detached from reality is tremendously problematic. And, you know, I'll throw something else in here that I've seen in looking at the educational materials that are put out by the public schools.
Right.
Many of them are changing their descriptions of biology to no longer talk about, for example, in health education, female puberty and male puberty. They just talk about bodies with certain parts. So it's just erasing the truth about who we are, all in service to this ideology.
That's right. Well, Mary, you've given us a lot of food for thought, and we'd love to have you come back and talk about the impact of this on children in schools. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks.
This is a time for men, for leaders who are faithful and virtuous witnesses to Christ and His church.
A new administration for the Knights of Columbus, the patron saint Supreme Knight Patrick Kelly says, will help guide the organization. Leading the charge for the future of the world's largest Catholic fraternal service organization, the Knights of Columbus. We take you now to New Haven, Connecticut for the installation ceremony of the new Supreme Knight, Patrick Kelly, in our Images of the Week.
It's a particular blessing to be gathered in this historic and beautiful church, which is dedicated to Our Lady and is the permanent resting place of our founder, Blessed Michael McGivney. I consider it a special honor to accept the office of Supreme Knight during this year of St. Joseph. This year is providential for the Knights of Columbus because there are few things the world needs more right now than men in the mold of St. Joseph. This is a time for men, for leaders who are faithful and virtuous witnesses to Christ and His Church. Catholic families are struggling to live out their faith and raise their children amid a culture that is increasingly hostile to our beliefs. Catholic husbands and fathers, especially the fathers of young children, need the encouragement and support of the Knights of Columbus. We can inspire them with the creative courage needed to keep their families strong in the faith. The more we dedicate ourselves to Christ and the Eucharist, the more we will be a sign of unity in an age of division and disbelief. This we will do, like St. Joseph, as guardians of the truth.
Patrick Kelly is a longtime executive leader with the organization, with 11 years as Vice President for Public Policy and serving as Deputy Supreme Knight since 2017. That wraps up this week's episode. I'm Montse Alvarado. Thank you for joining us. Tune in next week for more in-depth reports and discussions.